Hey, Tim Frisch with A Frisch Perspective, your Christian nerd bringing you analysis, reviews, and fun. In this video, we're going to be looking at Grace Community Church's leadership and a blog post they recently did in relationship to California's restrictions on churches. So this blog post from Grace Community Church, John MacArthur, pastor there, and the elders of that church, just put out this statement. And the title of it is, Christ, not Caesar, is head of the church, a biblical case for the church's duty to remain open. So you can see from the title there that this is talking about their position that the church should remain open during this time. And this is a real hot button issue, especially in places like California, where there is a resurgence in the cases of COVID-19. And the government is clamping down more on different places gathering, including churches. So they are trying to really limit large gatherings. Churches are being affected by that. Earlier this year, there were restrictions, and I think a lot of churches were understanding and accommodating to that. But now that the government is kind of reasserting those restrictions, churches in some cases are really pushing back on that, and that's what we're seeing here. So I'll show you a little bit of the article, and then I'd like to give some commentary on it. So it says it's a statement from John MacArthur and the elders of Grace Community Church. And the premise that they're relaying here is that in response to the recent state order requiring churches in California to limit or suspend all meetings indefinitely, we, the pastors and elders of Grace Community Church, respectfully inform our civic leaders that they have exceeded their legitimate jurisdiction, and faithfulness to Christ prohibits us from observing the restrictions they want to impose on our corporate worship services. Later in the statement they say, when officials restrict church attendance to a certain number, they attempt to impose a restriction that in principle makes it impossible for the saints to gather as the church. When officials prohibit singing in worship services, they attempt to impose a restriction that in principle makes it impossible for the people of God to obey the commands of Ephesians 5:19 and Colossians 3:16. When officials mandate distancing, they attempt to impose a restriction that in principle makes it impossible to experience the close communion between believers that is commanded in Romans 16:16, 1 Corinthians 16:20, 2 Corinthians 13:12, and 1 Thessalonians 5:26. In all those spheres, we must submit to our Lord. So you can see the case that they're making there, using biblical passages to bolster what they're saying, but they're really talking there about how the church has a mandate to assemble, and they want to be faithful to that mandate because that's what the church is. A church is an assembly. It's a gathering of Christians. So in looking at this issue, I would say there really are two sides to it. One thing to keep in mind is that the government is making restrictions, but not just on the church. The government is also putting restrictions on other entities as well, such as baseball, sports gatherings, theaters, and other entities. So it's not as if the government is actually saying all other places can meet and gather except for churches. Now, what makes this challenging and tricky is that some places like supermarkets, for example, Walmart, they do get very crowded, and yet those places are allowed to be open and people are allowed to gather in relatively large gatherings in those places. But at the same time, we do have to be fair, and on that side of it say, yeah, governments aren't just restricting churches. They are also putting restrictions on other entities as well. But the other side of this is that these other entities that we're looking at here, for Christians, are nothing like the church, because those other things are not really essential. We might like to go to the movies or go to a ball game. I actually happen to love baseball, but it is not essential for me as a Christian. I don't look at that as essential. Whereas church and gathering with other believers to the Christian is essential. And that's what's being brought out in this statement here, is that is by definition what the church is. It's a gathering of believers, and we're commanded to do that. So in light of the two different sides of this, I think, first of all, I would say that some level of pushback is probably appropriate, especially when you're looking at certain regions of our country where there are a lot of restrictions. And I can understand where churches like Grace Community Church are coming from. I happen to live in upper New England, and the restrictions here are not tight. COVID-19 is not spreading very much here, and so we're in a really good position. There are some government guidelines that are given to us, and generally I think churches have no problem following them. Also, our churches up here, generally speaking, aren't that big, so that makes things easier as well. But in places like California, where you have big churches and a lot of government restriction, you do get into these thorny issues a lot more. And so I do think that some level of pushback is understandable, because we do want to make it clear that as Christians, ultimately, we are following the authority of Jesus. So that's how we function as church. We don't need the government to tell us what we can and can't do as Christians, although part of our belief as Christians is we do want to honor the government as much as possible. It is an authority given by God to govern the state, and that's actually brought out in their statement as well. But at the end of the day, our authority as the church and as believers is Jesus. So I can understand the pushback side of things here, but I would also say that we should acknowledge that governments, if we're going to be fair, are dealing with a lot of difficult choices. Governments have to decide what is the safest way to proceed in this situation. And I have to say, I do have some level of sympathy for these government leaders. They're not just deciding about churches, they're deciding about a lot of other institutions. And let's face it, there are a lot of other people in our country, business owners, for example, that are really being affected by the decisions of governments. And the government officials, I think, are really trying to weigh what is the safest thing to do for the population. So I think that has to be factored into all of this as well. There's a couple other things that I think we should be giving thought to, and one is that there are alternative means of gathering today because of internet technology and the ability to use social media. A lot of churches have used the internet to continue to gather in an alternate way. Now, I realize that's not ideal, and for some churches it's not even doable. And another thing I would say is long-term, that's not really a great solution. I do think that a physical gathering of Christians is very important and vital to our life as the church. But I would also say that we can come up with ways to reconfigure things in different ministries so that we can continue to meet in smaller groups and find ways to gather as Christians that aren't violating government guidelines. And I will say that this whole scenario really makes the case for having a lot of smaller congregations rather than huge megachurch ministries. Now, I'm not in a megachurch ministry myself, so it's easy for me to say this. But I will say that you can see that there are a lot of advantages for Christians to be meeting in small gatherings scattered over a large area. And that's advantageous in multiple ways. But one of the ways it's advantageous is that when the government puts restrictions on churches, it's a lot easier to adapt if you have a lot of small congregations rather than huge gatherings of Christians like you do in certain megachurch ministries. So this is really a particularly better, easier time for smaller gatherings of Christians and smaller churches to adapt to the situation. So really, I have a lot of sympathy for these large churches. They have, I'm sure, large staff, a lot of expenses, and so it's really challenging when the government says to these large churches, you can't gather. But in the long run, I would definitely agree that we do need to be gathering as Christians, and we do the best we can to adapt, but it is important for us to meet in person. Another thing that I want to say in all of this is that a big issue that's being brought up here is the concept of the separation of church and state. And this kind of situation really forces us to examine ourselves. How do we look at that, and are we consistent in our views of the separation of church and state? I thought this was an interesting article title that I was reading. It says, "Church Defying Shutdown Order in California Received Paycheck Protection Loan of at least $350,000. Now, that is not referring to Grace Community Church, by the way, But an interesting thing that you're seeing here from the perspective of outsiders is that churches will receive money from the government in the form of the Paycheck Protection Loan, but then they will defy the government's orders about gathering. Now, in all fairness, I think that churches earlier this year might have received money from the Paycheck Protection Loan program, and they were actually following the mandate to close. And now, when the government is reimposing restrictions, those same churches may not receive money. But it does bring up the fact that sometimes as Christians, we are willing to accept certain government support and oversight and benefits, but then in other ways we want the government to have nothing to do with us. So it can be tricky. We have to acknowledge that. And I'm just saying I think we have to try our best to be consistent as we think about the issue of church and state. This came up, by the way, earlier this year in something that John MacArthur said, and I'll quote it for you. He says, "So in response to the leadership of our president, we're going to go to church, and we're going to go to church this Sunday." And that was in response to President Trump saying that churches are an essential service. And so John MacArthur was saying, well, in response to what Trump said, we are going to open. Now, MacArthur was in no way saying that Trump is telling churches what to do and he's the head of us. But you can see that the way that he worded that there, to people from the outside, it does kind of sound like he's saying, we want to follow the government in this situation, but then when the government says you have to close, and the California government says that, he says, no, we don't want to follow the government. So I think consistency says we have to be careful how we communicate. We have to make sure that we're not ultimately giving authority to the government over the church when it comes to church matters. The government exercises its authority in its sphere, and that's exactly what the leaders of Grace Community Church are saying. But I would say that the government actually is trying to keep people safe, and I want to acknowledge that. At the same time, I would also understand that churches do want to give thought to, are they allowing the government to exercise too much control in saying how should they operate as churches? So consistency when it comes to this idea of separation of church and state is very challenging. So to wrap all of this up, it's obvious that as churches, and I can see what's being said in this statement, we want to be faithful to the Lord. We want to do what Jesus said. I mean, that's why we call ourselves the church, because we are identifying ourselves with Jesus. And so we want to be faithful, and ultimately we want to obey him over any human institution. That's understandable. So if a government institution is telling us to do something that is against what God tells us to do, we want to obey God rather than man. But God does tell us we are to be submissive to governing authorities as long as they're not causing us to sin and go against his commands. So we have to weigh all of these things out. But as we're trying to be faithful to Jesus, we also want to make sure that we have a good testimony. And that's particularly challenging in this time right now as the world is watching us react to different things. And that's why I advocate for us to try to be fair in the way that we assess these things and try to be gracious. Yes, I do want to make sure that I'm not letting the government totally control how I function as a church, but I also want to make sure that I'm not doing something that to the world sounds really inconsistent and hypocritical. So that's why I bring up receiving money from the government, but then not listening to the government. We have to really think these things out and be careful about it. So I haven't answered all the questions about this. I really just wanted to bring this topic up and give some thoughts on it, but I'd love to hear what you think in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for listening to what I have to say from A Frisch Perspective.